All right. I am honored to be joined by Steve Suits. Thank you so much for being here. We're going to talk about one of your many books. The book that we're going to talk about is called A War of Sections: How Deep South Political Suppression Shaped Voting Rights in America. So thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you. So the book is called A War of Sections, and I would love for you to just tell me a little bit about the sections that went to war in Alabama.
Yes. Well, we start with, I think, the misconception that most of Alabama's political history is a war between black folks and white folks. And that certainly at times and in many of the eras was true. But probably the most enduring division, the greatest political wars of Alabama, were between South Alabama, specifically what's known as the Black Belt of Alabama, where the enslavers lived, and North Alabama, which was mostly dirt farmers and struggling small farmers who often owned their own small plots of land and had no slaves or very few slaves, with the exception of the Tennessee Valley, the fertile Tennessee Valley, which was generally a slave holdings area. So this division between Alabama South and North was in fact predated the War of Northern Aggression, as some Southerners called it, from the Civil War.
Right. So this was with this kind of division. You're describing a class division between more wealthy, I suppose, plantation owners, slave owners in what was called the Black Belt, the South, and poorer white, probably farmers and laborers in the North.
Yeah.
Is that an accurate
Oh,
description?
yes. Oh, yes. It was a class division and a class warfare, political warfare.
And how did this class division at the sort of express itself early in the states? When did Alabama become a state? And was this a feature of its original constitutional convention?
It was a part of the debate about statehood and the terms of statehood in 1819. And the biggest division that occurred was a North-South division, and that was the question of whether or not, in apportioning the legislature, whether slaves would be counted, as they were in the federal system, as three-fifths persons. And North Alabama, the small farmers of North Alabama, vehemently opposed and prevailed. And so, beginning with statehood, the state legislature was never, with one small exception that later in the 1840s, it was never apportioned according to the number of slaves anyone had, whole or in part. So that was the beginning of the debate and the beginning of the political warfare between the Black Belt, which, by the way, was not known for its black population. The Black Belt was the color of the soil, rich cotton-growing soil. And so historically, the Black Belt as a cotton-growing area drew in all the black slaves who became a part of the political warfare in one way or the other over the time.
Interesting. So what you're saying is that the North didn't want slaves to be counted as in apportioning votes because those slaves were in the South. The South wanted to count them, but of course without giving them the right to actually participate in the democratic process.
That's right. They argued the spirit of independence. They said the Black Belt planters said, this is the way the federal system was designed and is operating. That's the way our U.S. Constitution is designed, and so we should copy the federal ratio, as they called it. And the white farmers and poor white farmers in North Alabama knew damn well that what that meant, which was it was giving the planters representation of in the legislature, while not in fact having white folks who could actually vote. The terms of the 1819 Constitution were fairly liberal, according to the day, in terms of who could vote. Originally, before we got other constitutional amendments, if you were white, male, and 21, you could vote. There were no property taxes, no property requirements, no poll taxes.
Right. And how did this sectional division matter at all during the antebellum period and then during the Civil War?
Oh, yeah. There were fights. Many by the 1840s, most of the Black Belt planters who by that time had a black population enslaved that was probably close to 40% of the state's population. In the 1840s, they were mostly Whigs. They generally believed in internal improvements financed by the government, something which generally North Alabama folks did not support. And the North Alabamians were generally at that time Democrats. So when secession was proposed and discussed, or even before the war broke out, North Alabamians, as a general rule, were those who opposed secession, although there were some Whigs, some planters, who thought it was too risky and would be disastrous for the slave system. But generally, those who were most vehement opposed to secession were in North Alabama. And when the war broke out, there was, in fact, a big divide between South Alabama and North Alabama as to who was loyal to the Confederacy. I grew up in what is called in Alabama history the Free State of Winston, because the small farmers in my county gathered together after the war broke out and passed a resolution saying that they didn't want to fight this war and that they wanted to be left alone. They certainly were not going to fight to defend slavery. The Confederates were not so obliging, and so they started trying to enlist and then require enlistment of young men in the North Alabama, and that led to a huge fight between many men in North Alabama and the Confederacy itself. There was in fact a regiment of the Federal Army, the Alabama 1st Cavalry, USA, that was formed largely from men in North Alabama, and they became a part of Sherman's march to the sea. So the Civil War essentially meant that Alabama began a true war between North and South Alabama. And after the Civil War, many of those who had opposed it from North Alabama became Republicans, scallywags, as they were called, and they and the carpetbaggers and soon afterwards the enfranchised blacks made up the Republican Party, while those who were the Confederates and who called themselves occasionally the Redeemers, they became the Democrats.
What were they redeeming?
They were going to redeem the South and Alabama back to its glory days of before the war, when everyone knew their place, and their place there was slavery, and then there was the aristocracy of the Black Belt, and then there were those poor folks up in North Alabama.
And the Northerners, they weren't anti-slavery, were they?
They didn't like slavery, but they weren't, and they certainly weren't going to fight to preserve slavery. But that didn't necessarily mean that they thought that black folks were equal citizens. On that question, there was no doubt that they would prefer, as it later became evident, they would prefer black folks simply leave Alabama. They wanted essentially a white democracy where everyone their philosophical views on this question of slavery and black folks is complex. Some there's documents of where some folks, for example, poor farmers in Winston County had families divided over some went to fight, a few went to fight for the Confederacy, and others went to fight in the 1st Alabama Cavalry. And so there's some correspondence that's been discovered over the years amongst family members. And the discussion about fighting and who to fight for. And, some of those letters show that there are terms like the infernal Negro or the infernal, some use the N word. But basically, what they thought was that, that black folks, enslaved black people, were being misused for the gains of a few white folks who thought they were better than the small farmers of North Alabama. So I don't think you could say that they opposed the secession and the Confederacy because they were anti-slavery, but I don't think you could say that they were, in fact, in any way supportive of the notion that people should be subjugated to a form of slavery, biblical or otherwise, they thought.
Was part of it essentially labor market competition?
Yes and no, probably more than no. The fact is that most of the small farmers in North Alabama did not participate hugely in a market economy. They were self-sufficient local farmers who may barter between themselves, but they put very little, except for the Tennessee Valley, into the market economy of selling goods and produce. That was the business of the slave owners, and so they didn't really see themselves in competition. What they did see themselves in competition is a way of life, and they believed in self-sufficiency. Many of them were folks whose ancestors had fought for independence. They had migrated to the West, which was what Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi was known in those days. And they were there living on their own land, sometimes maybe squatting on their own land, but managing to live there independently of the government and independently of anyone else. And that was not at all the lifestyle of the planters. And so there was this competition between a philosophy of how to live your life more than there was a competition in the market economy.
Right. And so if we're talking about sort of around the Civil War period or immediately post-Civil War, could you give me a sense of the demography here?
Yeah. Well, by the time the war broke out, the Alabama black population, the enslaved black population of Alabama, was just about 48%. It was almost, in some southern states, Mississippi and South Carolina especially, they were a majority of the total population. In the counties of the Black Belt, white folks would probably amount to about one, on average, about 1 out of every 15 persons. The North Alabama population was roughly around 35% of the total white population. There was Central Alabama. They were a swing part of the political equation before the war. And then there was the South Alabama, which the Black Belt controlled. Concerted efforts politically came out of North Alabama, or they came out of the very few planters of the Black Belt. The other parts of Alabama generally would go with one or the other depending on economic and political circumstances. So it wasn't just a straight line that you could draw to say everybody below this line is part of the Black Belt and everybody above it's part of North Alabama. But you could draw a line around right below Birmingham's Jefferson County and take it over from east to west, and that pretty well would define what the North Alabama was.
Then why was Southern Alabama so politically dominant if it wasn't demographically dominant?
Well, it had money, and it had influence. I mean, think about this period of time when if you were a small farmer in my home of Winston County, Alabama, you had to work your farm 12 months out of the year, even when you weren't planting, you were preparing the soil. It was a full-time occupation. And so planters, however, had both wealth and mobility. They could go to Montgomery anytime they wanted to. Their overseers would see to the slaves working the land. And so there was simply this ability of money and a mobility to decide what happened down in Montgomery. And oftentimes the black belt folks would prevail on account of those two factors. There is another factor which comes to play, especially after the war, and that is simply that the black belt planters were a very tight unit, and they were also a very astute tight unit, and they knew what mattered and what didn't in how you shape policy and practice in the state government. And so they were much more focused and clear-headed about what they wanted to achieve using their money and their mobility than many times folks in North Alabama, who were a much broader population and who most folks didn't go outside their own county during their lifetime.
So from 1819 to, call it, 1865, did the northern counties ever control the governorship or the state house?
Well, the state house was more important. The governor's post was a statewide election, and they did win some of those elections. Although you wouldn't be able to necessarily measure that by whether the person who was elected governor was from North Alabama or whether they were from South Alabama or the Black Belt, because the Black Belt planters figured out pretty early in Alabama state history that there were lots of folks in North Alabama who also had some slaves. And so trying to promote those folks for statewide political office often became the strategy that the Black Belt planters preferred.
If we took a poll of white residents of the state right around the time of the Civil War, what percent of them do you think would identify more as Unionists than as secessionists?
Before the war?
Yes, before the war.
Probably in North Alabama, I'd say probably. I mean, this is rank speculation because I don't think there's any good indicators of this. But if I were to speculate on the top of my head, I'd say probably in North Alabama, maybe a third of the population would be called anti-secessionists. Probably another 1/3 to 45% of the North Alabama population would be thought of as cooperatists. In other words, they wanted to cooperate with the Union and not necessarily secede, but not necessarily deal with the problem of slavery. Just leave it as it was.
Right. Right. Was apportionment a big part of how Southern Alabama maintained its relative power in the state?
Well, when they didn't have the votes to carry the day in the legislature, they were smart enough early on, smarter than most of the politicians in North Alabama, frankly, to understand how the legislature works. And as you know, as a great student of politics that you are, the legislature works on both protocols, rules, and committees. And they knew that getting control of the right committees was their way of winning without a majority whenever they didn't have enough friends from Central and other parts of South Alabama. And so they would always decide what committees a member of the Black Belt delegation should control. And they would go after that and give up other powers or other privileges, sometimes even giving up the election of the Speaker pro tem or the Speaker himself or the presiding officer of the state Senate in order to gain control of committees, which had the power by custom and by rule to keep any bill that they didn't like from getting to the floor. So they knew how to play the politics a lot better than other folks did in Alabama before the war.
Let's Let's talk about the period of Reconstruction. I'm curious first to just get your synthesis of history of what the state was like under the relatively brief window of Reconstruction, and in particular how these sections were expressed and interacted during this period.
Well, once once the war ended and the provisional governments were set up by the first by President Johnson, Andrew Johnson, and then by the Congress, the Republican Congress. The initially there was considerable reluctance on the part of those scallywags, Southerners who had supported the Union or opposed secession. There was considerable reluctance on their part to do anything but just keep the status quo. But that was not at all satisfactory, especially when one of the provisional legislatures refused to ratify the 14th Amendment of the federal Constitution, and that broke the provisional legislature's ability to do anything. And so once the Congress required the passage of the 14th Amendment, and immediately after 1868 began having federal registrars register black folks to vote as a condition of congressional Reconstruction. Then Reconstruction really began, especially with the election of 1868, election of 1869, 70. Those were when black folks for the first time began being elected to the state legislature, when carpetbaggers, folks from the North who had come down who were pro-Union, and the scallywags, the native whites who had supported the Union or at least opposed to secession. That's when they took control as a collective. However, they didn't get along among themselves very well, and there was great division in the political Republican Party, which they all comprised. The consequence of that is that the Democrats began with each election almost to understand that the more they could rally the flag of white supremacy and unify the Democrats and continue to find some other white folks in North Alabama, a few of those to support them, that they might win the political war of post-Reconstruction. There was a lot of violence. The first Klan emerged and was used. They and other vigilante groups were used to target both white Unionists as well as black advocates and black voters. And so it was a period of violence, premeditated violence. People were murdered before elections. They were murdered on Election Day. There were federal troops stationed, not, maybe less than 600 federal troops across all of Alabama, but there were federal troops under the Ku Klux Klan Act and the Reconstruction Acts. So it was a very turbulent time, and probably one of the two primary factors for why the Republicans did not stay in power, why the Democrats in 1874 won all the statewide elections and began the process of undoing Reconstruction in Alabama, were two factors. One was, of course, waving the bloody flag of white supremacy and talking about, there was no Democrat ever accused someone of being a Republican. They accused them of being a black Republican. Everything was racialized in the political process by the Democrats. And then the second factor was probably the divisions, how the carpetbaggers, the scallywags, and the black leaders could not get themselves unified. And of course, one of the divisions of that, one of the factors of that disunity was the role of black people in the Republican Party in Alabama. And there were quite a few carpetbaggers and quite a few white scallywags who who wanted black votes, but certainly did not want any black person to hold office. And that became a major issue both in the general election when black folks began to appear in statewide elections, and that would have been 1872. And it became an issue that the white redeeming Democrats could use to bring over more white votes to its side.
And at this time, we call it kind of 68 to 72 or 74. What was the rate of black voting in the state?
Very high, very high. We don't have turnout numbers that are anywhere as reliable as they are today, but after the 1868 registration process, there were more black voters than white voters for a period of time. It becomes complicated in that one of the initial strategies of the Democrats, white Democrats, was to boycott elections so as to trip up the ratification of Alabama back into the Union, because the way the federal legislation for readmission was worded, that it required a certain percentage of turnout of registered voters, and so they thought they would boycott. So initially they discouraged people from both registration and from voting. But after Alabama was readmitted and Congress changed the law to allow the readmission, then they began registering more and more, and their turnout became larger and larger. So that what we know is that we know what the turnout was in elections by party. And what we know is that with each succeeding election, with the exception of 1872, the Democrats gained more and more of the electorate as the elections approached 1874.
So essentially, it was sort of a white backlash that built over time to black voting.
That's right. To not so much to black voting as to black influence that comes with black voting.
And why, if black voters constituted a majority of the state at this time, why couldn't they alone sort of constitute a political faction that was dominant?
That's a good question. Well, there were three factors, I think, that were primary that prevented it. One was, you have to remember, most of the black folks were still in the Black Belt. Most of them were still in some kind of arrangement, economically dependent on the Black Belt planters for either a tenant contract for work on their farms or sharecropping, which was beginning to appear. So economically, black folks were dependent on the same people who had enslaved them. And when the planters didn't want folks to go to the polls, they had more than one way in which to discourage black folks from doing that, even if they were registered voters. The second factor was, of course, that there were ways in which to discourage them that were direct and violent, and that's where the Klan and the vigilante groups came in. The planters never admitted that they were in any way a part of the Klan, although there were episodes where people who were planters were exposed as being part of the Klan. But the vigilantes were simply willing to intimidate, physically harm, and at times murder people for thinking that they could go vote. And then the third factor, I think, was that as time went on, there were increasing divisions among the black population about amongst who should be the leadership. And so there's competition about which candidates. For example, in the congressional district that was the largest majority black congressional district in Alabama at that time, it elected in 1870 a black man to Congress, the first person to go to Congress who was black in Alabama history. But in the next election, he, in fact, was defeated because there was another black who wanted the nomination, failed to get it, and therefore ran independently, and the black vote split, and the white Democrat was elected. Well, that discouraged folks from thinking that in fact, black voters from turning out in subsequent elections in that district. So I think those factors explain why sometimes in the South, having a majority of the votes, if you're a black person, doesn't necessarily mean in those times that you were going to win the election.
Could you tell me about the recession of Reconstruction, the withdrawal of federal troops, and sort of how the state went back to a deeply kind of democratic white supremacist politics?
Yeah, when the redeeming Democrats won all the statewide elections in 1874, that was when they moved to proceed to make sure there would be no Reconstruction in Alabama again. They did so by passing the 1875 Constitution, which set up barriers to black voting. Some of them pretty obvious, but there was also some that were not so obvious. For example, one of the changes they made, in addition to the state constitution, or along with the state constitutional changes, was to require everyone who voted to vote in the precinct of their residency. And that seems like a very non-racial requirement to anyone who would read the law on its face. But the context was that because of the intimidation and violence that I've discussed, black folks often on election day would try to go away from their place of residence outside the control on election day of their white planter boss, and they would group together and usually go to the county seat and vote there as a group. And they did so in order to as a group because it was much less likely that the Klan would bother a group of 100 to 200 black folks than they would 2 or 3 black folks. Well, when that law changed, it essentially meant there was no protection by group, no protection by distance for the black voter. And so you saw a decline in the next 2 or 3 elections of black voting, in part because of that one on its face, non-racial change. Well, of course, the Republicans wanted the Grant administration and then the Republican Congress to provide federal troops and protections for the increase of intimidation that was happening. But that's when the 1876 presidential election created the Biden-Tilden compromise, and that was the federal troops would be withdrawn. And once those troops were withdrawn, the Democrats knew they could do damn well what they wanted, and they did.
So in short, kind of what happened between 1876 and 1901?
Well, there was a period of time in which Democrats continued to try to attract some black votes because the folks who were still in North Alabama still outnumbered them. And if they could get some folks in the Wiregrass or the Central Alabama to go along with them, they could carry the day. That especially happened during the populist era when white and black folks got together in Alabama and other southern states and decided that this issue of class was quite real and that it might even be more important than the issues of race to white people. And so there was this period of populism in which some folks who did run in the Democratic Party sometimes, but not, and some who ran in the Republican Party for various congressional seats, challenged the system. But essentially, the black belt planters said we need to solve this problem of black folks trying to decide which white folk get to win. And so their notion was, let's have a convention in which we restructure the Constitution so that white people can decide how we're going to have winners and losers in elections. And we can take black people out of the the equation. There were some Democrats who freely admitted, if we could only take black voters out of the politics, then we could stop stealing the elections from you. Well, it was a very kind of Trumpian admission, one would have thought, but it was said. And so they did hold a constitutional convention. The Black Belt planners were smart enough to make sure that the form of the election, in terms of who got to be delegates and how they were elected, would assure that they and their allies would have a majority at the Constitutional Convention, which produced the 1901 Constitution.
And what were the key changes in the 1901 Constitution?
Well, the key changes were relating to voting and to office holding. And the key changes were that essentially the grandfather clause was adopted, which meant that in essence, if you had a descendant who fought for the Confederacy, you were a voter. The second was that there were property qualifications. You had to own a certain amount of property that was valued, and then there was the poll tax, and there were some changes in the methods of registration. And finally, there was a requirement for almost any office, from the lowly JP to the governor of the state, that you had to be bonded. In other words, and usually it started at $1,000. Well, let me tell you, $1,000 was a big bond in 1901. And so an office holder had to post a bond, and that meant that if you were from, say, North Alabama, you'd have to, where outside of the Tennessee Valley, most property was valued at closer to $150 rather than $1,000. You'd have to get lots of your friends and neighbors to put their property up as bond in order just to serve in the office if you were elected. And there were quite a few instances after 1901 where people, black folks and white folks, were not able to take office because they weren't able to collect enough property to bond themselves to hold the office. While, of course, the Black Belt planners, they had no trouble, because most of them, in fact, had land and cotton supplies and other things that were far beyond $1,000. So it was all of those. Now, do remember that those terms that disfranchised black folks also disfranchised a significant number of white folks in North Alabama. The poll tax was one factor. That meant you had to pay $1 or later $2 and such to be able to vote per capita. That was for folks who were primarily in a barter economy where they would trade with their neighbors about this and that. That was a big expense. The second was property value. There were folks who still had property, small farmers of $100, and that value would not get you a vote. You had to have more than that. And then there were the whole process of being having had an ancestor who fought for the Union Army. My ancestor wasn't grandfathered into being a voter. He had to meet all these other qualifications. And so the failure of old Unionists to be able to be grandfathered in was another factor that eliminated a goodly number of white North Alabama voters.
And were the rates of black voting high enough before the 1901 convention that this seemed necessary to the kind of Southern Democrats?
Well, it wasn't in all elections, but the populist movement really scared them, because it was, as your earlier question suggested, in earlier eras, whether white folks in North Alabama would actually band together effectively with black folks from South Alabama was always something that even during Reconstruction never could be solidified. But it began to look very solid during the populist era. And that scared folks to think that in the Black Belt to think that this could in fact be a revolution, political revolution that was permanent.
So let me take a step back here because we've covered a lot of ground,
We sure have.
and we haven't even gotten to the main focus of the book. But we've covered from 1819 to 1901, and I want to synthesize here, and you can correct me where I get something wrong or miss something important. So 1819, Alabama becomes a state. Even then, there's a significant division between the sort of more wealthy southern plantation owners and the northern laborers who tend to be kind of self-sufficient and agrarian. Then the proxy battle between these two is, for instance, in whether slaves should be counted, granting representation to different folks. Of course, the northern laborers don't want slaves to be counted for without having and without being able to vote. So then, over the next several decades, up through the Civil War, the sort of the southern faction is generally more dominant, although there are some northerners that are also elected, and there's some kind of messiness to the coalitional politics. But the southern plantation owners are wealthier and more cohesive as a unit. During the Civil War, some northerners actually fought with the Unionists, and so there was quite a bit of kind of anti-secessionist sentiment among the Northerners. They certainly didn't want to fight and die for slavery, but they were insufficiently represented, insufficiently dominant in Alabama politics to change the course of, to actually change Alabama's allegiance. And then post-Civil War, there's a brief period of Reconstruction, kind of 1868 to 74, where Black folks are elected. The first Black congressman from Alabama. For a brief period, Black voters outnumber white voters, or at least Black registered voters. I'm not sure if actually in practice at the voting booths, and there's some fragile alliance between Black voters and Northern laborers and carpetbaggers from outside the state. But it's a fragile alliance, and still the sort of Southern coalition is more cohesive. In 1874, they win a trifecta. They dominate state government, and they start reining in. They start sort of passing laws that substantially restrict Black voting and representation. And after 1876, the government withdraws federal troops and effectively greenlights the end of Reconstruction and the continued suppression of the Black vote. This is briefly sort of broken during the Progressive period, where Black voters ally with Northern laborers again, and there's kind of a class alliance that forms. And this is something I think throughout American history, the kind of white plantation owners have feared, as any sort of class alliance. And that is the context for the 1901 convention, where the sort of mostly Southern and Central Democrats significantly restrict the ability of Black folks to participate in civic life at all. Would you like to correct any part of that summary?
The only correction I would make, it was a very good summary. I would make, you referred to the populists as progressives. They were not progressives by even Southern standards. They were populists.
Makes sense. Okay, good. So we're now at 1901. They just adopt this new constitution and substantially restrict the ability of Black folks to vote and to participate in civil life. Let's maybe talk about where your book opens, the 1921 Evans Amendment, which fails. Maybe if you could talk about how the Southern and Northern coalitions participate in crafting this amendment and in the politics of this amendment.
Well, this is after World War I, and it is in the middle. It comes about, this constitutional amendment gets put on the ballot by Black Belt politicians at a time when there is considerable economic disturbances in and around Birmingham, which after the Civil War became a major area for industrial development and mining. And so the Evans Amendment is an attempt for the Black Belt to perfect what essentially they were not able to do entirely in the 1901 Constitution. And they thought that this was a good time in which to propose it, because there was this major strike going on in Birmingham area. The United Mine Workers were in a life-death struggle with the industrialists of Birmingham, who were attempting to roll back the federally enforced minimum requirements for pay and conditions that had been established because of World War I. And the industrialists decided that they could no longer live with those, and the war was over, and they wanted to go back to paying people a lot less and spending a lot less money on mine safety. And so there was this major strike. Well, the strike was by a union that was probably the only biracial, interracial organization in the state, the United Mine Workers. They had a slight majority of black workers, and they had a minority of white workers. But they were in total in the Birmingham area probably 25,000 people, men working in the mines and in the mills. And so the Black Belt planners moved forward with this constitutional amendment and did not expect that the miners would have the presence of mind to try to make sure that it wasn't passed. But the miners did have the presence of mind, and they, in fact, organized even during the strike. And in fact, the strike ultimately did fail, and most of the miners who went on strike had to leave Alabama or were blacklisted so that they could never work for any industrialist again. But their one claimed achievement was that they helped to defeat the Evans Amendment. Well, the Evans Amendment was attempting to put in to the Constitution what the 1901 Constitution Convention wasn't able to achieve, and that is they were requiring in addition to all the other requirements, they wanted the registrars to be able to allow people to vote only if they were of good character and understood the duties of citizenship in a Republican form of government. Well, North Alabamians knew exactly what that meant in the eyes of the Black Belt planters, and they knew that they were, in fact, now having great trouble electing anybody to state office, especially to the governor's chair. And so it was the governor. The state law said that there were 3 officers who appointed local voter registrars. They were not appointed locally. They were appointed by the governor and 2 other insignificant statewide officers. And so the governor actually controlled the appointment of voter registrars. And so they knew who the Black Belt friendly governors would appoint, and they knew that those folks did not have a high opinion of the character of North Alabama poor farmers, and they certainly didn't think they knew how to run a government, so their sense of duties of citizenship in a Republican form of government was also highly suspect. So this was the amendment they wanted to pass, and this was what the black and white United Mine Workers knew also was aimed at them, because any white person in 1921 who would associate on any kind of social terms, much less belong to a union with black folks, any white person who would do that was almost de facto of a suspect moral character, and certainly didn't understand how the Republican government of Alabama small r, Republican government of Alabama should be run. So they opposed it, and they won.
So this was an example of essentially a successful class coalition that cut across race.
It was, and if you try to find the results of that election in any Alabama history book or in the volumes of the Alabama Archives' annual register, you will have to go to that one volume that does mention it and go to the back of it under miscellaneous and see, not in the election section of the book, but in the miscellaneous section, a fleeting reference to it. It was nothing that anyone in Montgomery or any of the history writers of the time wanted Alabamians to remember.
Wow. Was this one, like, were there other instances more broadly around this time of cross-racial coalition? And were Black voters still, after the 1901 convention, were they still voting in any substantial number?
No, they had all been disfranchised except for a symbolic handful that the white primary didn't necessarily have to at that by 19 in the 1920s. The white primary didn't have to have rules that excluded blacks because they weren't enough black folks who were able to register to vote. So there were rules against it, but they didn't have to, because probably in 1920, probably the number of black folks who were registered, and there were a handful in each county, less than 200 in a statewide. And usually that was, they allowed those folks to register because it offered some symbolism that if you were of good character and black, you could register, at least by good character by their definition of the term.
Right, right. So overwhelmingly, the 1921 amendment failed because of white voters.
That's right.
So then 25 years later, in 1946, we have essentially the same amendment, and this time it passes. So what changed?
Well, that's a good question. The Boswell Amendment, as it was called, and it's been a hallmark event in Alabama history as being clear evidence of the intent of Alabama white voters to make sure that black folks couldn't vote. And there's been generally in voting rights history, there's been no real distinction made about how it got passed and who supported it. It was a bizarre moment in Alabama history, political history, because it was a time when there was some political change going on. Probably the only populist governor of Alabama in the 20th century and perhaps even the 19th, Big Jim James Folsom was elected that year, unexpectedly elected. And I make the case in my book that had Big Jim Folsom clearly and aggressively taken the position in public and campaigned against the amendment, which he opposed, that it would probably have failed because of North Alabama votes. But the peculiar circumstances were that he wins, and Big Jim, who was you can take your pick. Governor Folsom told me that in 1946, he was at least 6 feet 9 inches tall, maybe 6'10". So he was a big man, a size 13 shoes. So Big Jim earned his name, but he also loved women. And he got elected, and he went philandering around Alabama and more often California and D.C. And the amendment itself was debated by folks who were known political quantities. But the peculiarity of it was that the daily newspapers in Alabama, especially the Montgomery Advertiser, which was the voice of the Black Belt, its editor decided to oppose this amendment, the Boswell Amendment. Well, and the Birmingham News decided to oppose it. And both of them, the Birmingham News was the voice of the big mules. That's what they called the industrialists. And so folks in North Alabama were reading the newspapers, when they got to them, about how it was that the opponents of Big Jim, big newspapers, who had said that the state would fall into utter calamity if he were elected, they were, in fact, opposing the amendment. And so it was only the night before the election that Big Jim returned to Alabama and went on the radio in Birmingham, a station that did not carry into much of North Alabama, and announced that he was opposing the amendment. And if you look at the election returns in the infamous Boswell Amendment, you'll see that happened in that election was that as many folks in North Alabama failed to vote on the amendment because they were confused or uncertain, as voted for or against, almost as many. And then on the other side, the Black Belt voted overwhelmingly for it. And in that election equation, it won by not an overwhelming majority, but a majority, and was passed. So I'm one of those, perhaps the only person in the world of scholarship who has suggested that the Boswell Amendment was not a ratification of all of white Alabama, that this is what needs to be the policy to keep riffraff, in the view of the planters, the riffraff that they accused of not understanding the duties of citizenship.
And why is Governor Folsom, Big Jim, opposed? Is it because is it because of his views on race, or is it because he worries that it's going to disenfranchise his voters, like Northern whites?
He opposed it because of both those reasons. He there's no recording of it, and there have been some vague recollections of what he said that night when he went on the radio in Birmingham. But essentially, and he, when I asked him later in life what he said and why he opposed it, Governor Folsom said, well, everybody knew it was going to hurt poor people. It was poor people he was trying to defend. And Big Jim, as his campaigns showed, especially in his 54 campaign, he didn't make any distinctions as to whether you were a black poor person or a white person.
Yeah, I would love to hear. I think he's one of the fascinating figures of the state's history. And since you've actually had the opportunity to sit down with him and have some conversations, I'd love to just, I guess, hear your reflections on who he was as a person, and relatedly, the kind of political coalition that elevated him.
Well, to quote Governor Wallace, who, when I asked him back in the day why he was a supporter in the 40s and 50s, early 50s, of Governor Folsom, which he was, he said, well, he believed in, he was trying to help the same people I was trying to help. And I interrupted the governor and said, at least at that time, you were trying to help him. But Big Jim had a unique ability to figure out how campaigning should be both entertaining and how it could be transformative. He actually was not from North Alabama. He actually came of age and grew up in the Wiregrass. Married the probate judge down there, who was a big supporter, who was an old populist himself, and a big supporter of Senator Hugo Black when he was in Alabama politics. But he moved he gradually moved towards North Alabama, where he spent the rest of his life. And whether it was north or south, he was always seeing himself as the man who would stand tall for poor folks. Today we'd call them working folks, but he called them mostly poor folks, because everybody in Alabama except the planters felt like they were poor. He during the New Deal, he ran a New Deal program out of Marshall County, which is at the Alabama-Tennessee border. And so he He understood what he interacted with people, had a sense of what they were concerned about, how they would talk about issues. And he ran for several offices, including the governor's position, twice before he got elected in 46. He was Governor Folsom in the 1954 campaign that he had. His slogan, which I think captures his style of politics, was "Y'all come." And there was his bluegrass band played that at every rally. And it if you know that song, it essentially says, it doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, all the neighbors, y'all come. And it was that kind of universal definition of y'all come. And nowadays there's a saying that young people in the South use in trying to make this point, and they say, y'all means all. And for Big Jim, y'all meant all, everybody. And back when I asked him later in the 70s once, I said, Governor, you made a reputation and a political career about talking about one man, one vote. You were using it before the courts got to the term. And I said, what about the women? He said, oh, Steve, I meant one lady, one vote too. And he did. He did. He was bigger than life in so many ways. Now, there were many folks, even what we would call back in those days Southern liberals, which I today consider myself one. But back in those days, there were Southern liberals, especially in the urban areas, who didn't like his style, thought it was off-putting, it was lacked sophistication. I mean, who would get an old bucket and call it a suds bucket and pass it around to get people's pennies and nickels as a campaign contribution, saying that once the suds bucket gets filled, he was going to clean up all of state government, especially those folks who were from the Black Belt. But they didn't like his style, and he also got the reputation of having corrupt administrations. Alabama, you could look at recent history, and Alabama's always had problems with accusations of corruption in state government. It's been a consistency that people don't quite willing to admit. But here's the fact that belies that Big Jim did anything for corruption. When he got out of office and he lost his last real campaign, Big Jim went to Coleman, Alabama, where he had decided to settle in North Alabama. And he was so strapped for money that he had to ask the local phone company, and it was a local co-op, and so he had some influence with them. But he had to ask the local phone company to put a public phone into his own house because he couldn't afford a regular landline. I don't think that's a man who benefited from corruption in office.
Curious, in 46 and in 55, was there a key policy issue that he ran on? Was it an economic campaign primarily?
It was one of the big issues was getting those roads paved, paving roads from farm to market, because by that time the barter system no longer worked in rural agricultural North Alabama. You had to get produce to the market, and even if you didn't have produce, you had to get to the county seat to be able to vote, serve in a jury, and the roads were to the many of the backwoods of Alabama, which was hilly, were muddy and impassable too often. When Hugo Black ran for the United States Senate in 1926, he went through two cars because the roads were so bad that it destroyed one of them, and he almost destroyed a second one just trying to get around the state. So paving the roads and building up local markets for produce and establishing labor laws. for the working folks who were not on the farms. Those were his major economic issues. But Big Jim also ran against the Black Belt. He said, this one man, this notion of taking the power away from the planters was very much a part of his campaign spiel.
What do you think the lesson of Big Jim is for Alabama and for the country? One of the ways to read him, to interpret him, is that when there is a sort of cross-racial class politics, you get a really different type of politics than when politics becomes primarily racial, kind of under the Wallace administration. Is that the right interpretation, or what do you take away from this period in history?
Yeah, I do think you're basically right. Now, what injured Big Jim's political career more than anything was in '54, because after Brown versus the Board of Education was issued, and the threat that white children would be forced to go to school with black children, Big Jim's capacity to keep a coalition together began to dissolve seriously. In fact, when he later ran, several months later, ran to be a representative of the Democratic Party at the next national convention, he wasn't even elected by the people at that point. So it essentially was that remember in 1949, this would have been the third year of his first term, he went on statewide radio right before Christmas and made a plea for giving black folks the vote, for treating them more equally. And it was not there was no outrage. There was no great concern about it. In 1949, he could make that kind of statement because there wasn't the primacy of race being the only thing that mattered. And I think when race became, for white Southerners, white Alabamians, so personal that my kids were going to go to school with a black person, Big Jim's ability to keep a coalition together on the basis of class simply diminished more and more.
I took constitutional history with Michael Klarman, who developed the backlash theory of Brown. Do you think that the backlash was as deep as it was, that it sort of stunted it seems like the course of Alabama's politics and the general, it seems like kind of maybe under Folsom, race relations were improving, they were moving in the right directions. Do you think it was that Brown was an edict from on high? Or so was it the fact that it was being imposed onto the state? Or was it the fact that kind of maybe we kind of got the order wrong? Like you start with a sort of economic populism and integration of Black Americans into the economy, and then you move to integration in the school system.
I think, well, I'll respond to your question, then I have an additional comment about it. I think the school issue was always an issue that was very personal for most Southerners, whether you had children, grandchildren, or your friends did. And the racial customs had always been where there were black folks, and especially in the Black Belt, that a child could have friendships with a white child could have friendship with a black child until the point of somewhere around pre-puberty. And then they had to be separated, because when they reached puberty, that was when this whole business of interracial relations becomes very personal. It involves sex, involves procreation, all of that. And that has always been the bedrock of the fear of black folks for white folks, is somehow that interracial connection would be personal. There was a lot of outrage with the removal of declaring the white primaries unconstitutional. But there was, certainly the Dixiecrats were very upset with that. But the fact is that there wasn't that kind of visceral, universal, deep anger and response to the white primary that Brown gave. So yes, I think the school issue was in particular the one that really did make it all very personal to people and frightening to too many white folks. That said, I don't subscribe to the view that if the court had just let the issue of the constitutional rights of the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment lay there because of Felix Frankfurter's notions of the political thicket or any other notion, I don't think it would necessarily have meant that we would have solved the race problem, or that Big Jim would have been able to move us far enough that black folks would not be in a subservient position. I don't subscribe to the notion that because Brown was so influential, if Brown hadn't happened, good things would have happened on their own to such an extent that we'd be in the same position we are today or better. I don't see the evidence for that. And, Derrick Bell, who was a friend of mine, argued with me a long time and argued with others that Brown should not have been rendered. I think it's pretty obvious, too, that the Southerners who were sitting on the court, Hugo Black and Tom Clark at the time, they understood that what this decision in Brown would mean for the South, but they had waited a long time for the South to move, and it hadn't, and separate but equal was not going to be ever equal. And so they cast the die.
So what's wrong with the story here that one might tell that, if only Brown wasn't decided, Folsom would have continued his sort of cross racial class politics, and over time, sort of black folks would be given the right to vote. There would be fewer voting restrictions, and they would just sort of gain political power representation over time. Where does that story break down for you?
Well, it breaks down on the assumption that Big Jim would have had the opportunity. He never was able to break the deadlock with the planters of the Black Belt. He, one year he called them into session, 6 times to do reapportionment? They didn't do it. And so, and Big Jim was, they were after him all the time. And while, one of the things about his concept of friends and neighbors and y'all come is that it got him into trouble oftentimes as much as trying to deal with the consequences of Brown did. You may not know, but Alabama historians and others who are my age remember the famous episode of Adam Clayton Powell coming down during the Montgomery bus boycott to visit, and he was a congressman from Harlem, and so Big Jim had him into the governor's mansion and served him. They had drinks together. Big Jim enjoyed a good drink. And then, of course, Adam Clayton Powell, knowing nothing about Southern politics, goes to the press and tells them all about how he and Big Jim had scotch together in the mansion. So Alabamians were just outraged, generally. I mean, the governor of the state of Alabama is allowing a black man to come in the front door of the governor's mansion and sit down with him and serve him scotch? Come on, what is Big Jim lost his mind? I mean, this is treating a black person as your social equal. It created an enormous stir. Got a lot of people ran against a lot of people not even running against Big Jim ran against that to get elected. I mean, and all Big Jim could say, given how he what he believed and his approach to biracial politics, all he could say was, "Well, boys," to the press, he said, "Boys, you know that's not right. You know I don't drink scotch." So yeah, I think Big Jim would have gotten himself into trouble because if he was not going to let that issue, if he didn't leave that issue alone generally, as the 50s went on. And, the Dixiecrats were responding to what was going on in the Trump administration. And even, the Trump administration, I'm sorry, Truman administration. I want to apologize to Harry Truman for that slip. No man deserves that comparison in public office. So Truman tried, in fact, in his civil rights planks of 48 to try to accent the whole business of employment and civil rights, and he essentially left the schools out of the equation. But there was the same reaction, much the same reaction to that. And I think, it's, to me, with all due respect to the scholars who've tried to keep this counterfactual proposition alive, I think it's an exercise in trying to figure out what the dog would have barked for the dog that didn't bark.
I'm just curious because you had the opportunity to, you said, talk about it with Derrick Bell. Was his primary objection to Brown the backlash thesis, or was it primarily that he thought that Black children would be better off if their schools were better funded instead of being integrated?
He thought that white folks will never accept Black people as their full equal, and that therefore having resources for Black folks, more resources for Black folks under that assumption was going to get a better education to Black children than trying to require integration as a way of increasing the resources to Black children in schools.
I see.
I think Derrick would agree with my summary.
So we're finally on to I think the period where the sections start to play less of a role and in the shadow of Brown. So maybe you could tell me a little bit about the 1959 election and Wallace and Patterson.
Yeah, that's the 58 election. And
58.
Wallace at that point has been a good supporter of Big Jim. He helped run part of his South Alabama campaign in 54 and was involved in his campaign in 46. But Wallace also read the temper of the times between 54 and 58, when Big Jim could not run for re-election because Alabama at that time had a state law that prohibited governors from succeeding themselves in the same term. The law Virginia still has. So George Wallace decides that he's got to get on the segregationist bandwagon. And so he becomes the reasonable segregationist in the 1958 campaign with Attorney General with Attorney General John Patterson, whose father was Albert Patterson, also the Attorney General who was murdered in Phoenix City in a mob action. Phoenix City was on the Chattahoochee River next to Georgia and was known for all sorts of illegal gambling and racketeering. So Attorney General Patterson has, with the help of some scrupulously judges on the Alabama Supreme Court and in the Circuit of Montgomery, is able to, as Attorney General, to ban the NAACP from Alabama. And it's something that other southern states tried to do, temporarily succeeded in doing, but through the connivance of some Alabama state judges, Patterson was able to make his stick. So what happens is that Patterson decides to run against the NAACP in his campaign. Now, it's not the only issue, but when he's talking about, here's what I'm going to do for economic development in the state, he says, now people say I can't do that. Well, I'm the only person who's been able to ban the NAACP from their state. I can do it, and that proves it. And he uses, when he's not campaigning against the NAACP, he's using it as a evidence as to why he can do things in other areas that no one else can do. And so race becomes a big issue in the 58 campaign. George Wallace is in that campaign saying that, well, we're going to have segregation, but we're going to need to obey the law. We're going to need to do this carefully. And it doesn't work for Wallace. Now, this is the campaign in which, after John Patterson wins as governor, Wallace is, according to Dan Carter, the definitive biographer of Wallace, when he says to his friends, "I'll never be out niggered again." And he never was.
The stunning thing there is that the state has been through there was a civil war. There was Reconstruction. There were all sorts of opportunities for white affinity to overcome class affinity, and yet sections persist for 130 years or something like that. Just despite that. So why is it here that these sectional differences lose their potency?
Yeah. Well, I think there are several factors that come to play in 58 and from 58 to 62 when Wallace runs as the premier segregationist. And one is that there's been a change in the economics of the state. White folks in North Alabama, on average, are not as poor. They're still certainly not a rich community, and not many, by national standards, not all that much middle class, more working class by current definitions. And I think while there is still some legacy of the New Deal in North Alabama politics. In fact, in 1958, the members of Congress in North Alabama, the 3 members of Congress, were all New Deal Democrats. But the issue of having now a different kind of opponent, someone other than the black belt planters who are trying to define how you live and trying to obstruct your sense of what is the good life. And part of that, very much a part of it, is trying to tell you what to think and how to act about black folks. I think that obviously was very attractive, and it was Wallace who perfected more than John Patterson. But Patterson showed the potential of it. I mean, the NAACP in Alabama was Ruby Hurley, a brilliant woman who I also got to know, running out of the Black Masonic Lodge and always counting her pennies as to how to get enough money to travel around Alabama and the rest of the South, and a state chairman who wasn't on the payroll and was selling black insurance in order to make a living. That was the great threat that John Patterson was keeping out of state. And it absolutely made no sense to anyone who looked at it. But what it did make sense politically is that this was a new enemy that the black belt planters understood could be a substitute for themselves as those people who North Alabama wanted to get rid of. And so, John Patterson was not their first choice for governor, but he became their first choice, and he moved it forward. And now, in that election, there were people who ran directly against the black belt, and they lost miserably. And so it was really when there was this moment of understanding that in Alabama politics, that age-old division could now become what had been the division that the planters always conceived of as far back as before the Civil War, which was, it was not them, but it was those Northerners, Washington, that was the real enemy of Alabama. And that, given what was going on, you got to remember that Little Rock crisis was going on in '58, when of all people, President Eisenhower sends federal troops who stationed themselves out at Little Rock High School to allow the admission of a flood of 12 kids. And this was the time when people were beginning to see in Alabama this whole business of the federal government's insistence on equality and race means our schools. It means something real personal, and that, I think, is why that transition time became an awakening for a black belt politician who was certainly not a slave. His family was never a slave owner, but he knew the black belt as well as anybody. And that guy was from named George Wallace, and he took it and ran with it.
One question that's been brewing in my head. I mean, you've spent your life studying the history of the state. You're probably one of the people who knows the history the most. How do you, so often kind of in this conversation, when we talk about almost any period of the state's political history, it feels like a tragedy. It has a sort of tragic narrative arc. There are periods of hope for interracial politics, and then that hope fades. What is it like to be a historian of a state where or of a political body where so often that political body is acting in a way that you now would consider immoral, or kind of pulling against the tide of history? Where do you find hope there? Like what so many historians are doing, I think, when they're studying history, is finding protagonists, right? It's sort of it's finding reasons for hope. It's trying to convince yourself that history is going in some positive direction. But you're studying a place that kind of so often didn't do that. So yeah, where do you find that protagonist? Where do you find that hope, or what is your
Yeah.
yeah?
Well, I found my protagonist of that sort in Hugo Black, the U.S. Supreme Court Justice reserved from 1937 to 1971. And he has all of the rich complexities of Southern history in his life story. When he was appointed, shortly after his appointment, the folks would quib, all he has to do is give up his Klan robe for his Supreme Court black robe, who had been a member of the Klan briefly in the 1920s. And especially for Northerners, that's a very hard biography to sort out and understand. So what's happened in most instances is that folks have simply said, well, he did that for political reasons, and then he went to Washington and became educated and saw the real ways of the world. And so the Hugo Black of 1927 was not the Hugo Black of 1947 when he issued the opinion in the dissent in Adamson v. California, insisting that the 14th Amendment applied the Bill of Rights to the states and local governments. Well, I didn't buy that. In my biography of Black's Alabama days, suggests that there was a liberal, Southern liberal, who navigated imperfectly Alabama politics, but his views, he took his views that he developed in Alabama and took them to Washington and applied them to that situation and to those roles that he played as a senator. So I have my own protagonist. That said, I do think there is a sense of resignation you have to have, that you cannot fundamentally change human nature by national politics or federal policy. And you can't even change much of Alabama and Southern politics. I tell my sons that this is what I want on my tombstone. He was born in a one-party South. He died in a one-party South. Different parties, same politics. And I think that if you think about that, that pretty well sums up my sense of how I try to look honestly about the people who've been my friends and neighbors for more than 7 decades. And I, I made a choice when I was a young man that rather than leave Alabama after graduating from high school, that I was going to stay and fight for what I believed in my own way. And I think of a lot of others of my generation who decided differently. But I think once you make that decision, what you're making a decision is that you're a Southerner who really will want to die in the South, but while he's living, really wants to make it better. There's a great quote from Lillian Smith, the Southern writer from North Georgia. James McBride Dabbs once said of her, she loved the South so much she wanted to make it better. I guess that's me.
That's really beautiful. I'll ask you just one more big question. And the project I've embarked on, I'm asking sort of how institutional design influences and sometimes secures political outcomes. Sort of how different the world would be if we had something closer to a parliamentary system. In your examination of Alabama politics, do you think that this kind of structure matters deeply, or does the close study of the state's history almost push in the opposite direction and suggests that structure is far downstream of public opinion and coalitions and culture?
I don't think it's far downstream. I think institutional arrangements matter a great deal. But I'm going to evoke Big Jim. What his entire approach to politics was that state ways matter, but so do folk ways. And I think those institutional arrangements are the state ways that we can create. But I think where the South has failed is in trying to shape those folk ways, whether it's through one's church or synagogue or mosque, or whether it's through neighborhood associations or county fairs or whatever. The folk ways that we seems to me to be something that is vastly neglected. It's one of the reasons Hugo Black was a economic radical by Southern standards. Who's going to propose a 6-hour work week in 1932? But the race issue was one that where the economic populism and race never came together. And Southern liberalism, by the time I came of age, was entirely defined by race. What was your position on race? And that position would could define you as a Southern liberal. In 1930, early 40s, economic liberalism in the South was the way to define liberalism. Those never met. And I think part of why they didn't meet is the labor unions, the churches, the volunteer associations. None of that work was done by Southerners that needed to be done in order to carry along the folk ways with the state ways. And so I'd say it's not a matter of which is more important, but I think it is that you can't neglect one and expect the other to carry all the weight. It's too heavy a load.
Well, Steve Suits, thank you so much. I just want to say also, it's incredible to me that you had the opportunity to speak with Big Jim and with Governor Wallace and with Derrick Bell. These are all, I was born in 99, kind of, these are figures of history. And it's wonderful to sort of be able to know that there are folks who sort of not only have deeply studied this history, but actually to feel the kind of intergenerational reality of history. So this has been an absolutely incredible conversation for me. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I'm really grateful.
Well, thank you for having the conversation. I appreciate very much your interest in the topic. Alabama's and the Deep South is seen by too many as a hopeless topic, not worthy of inquiry and investigation. And thank you for being interested in it.